Good afternoon, everybody. As Dave said, my name is Sarah Reeves, and I'm the Executive Director for the Chittenden Solid Waste District in Vermont. I am also the second Vice President for the MWMA, which, among other things, means that I am very much looking forward to hosting you to the Fall Summit in 2025. And if you didn't know, if our state marketing team hasn't done their job well enough. Vermont is beautiful at this time of the year, so I really hope that you'll make it and be able to join us there for the Fall Summit 2025. So the topic for this session, PFAS, and I'm going to read it because I can't remember off the top of my head, perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, known as forever chemicals. According to the National Institute of Health, 97% of Americans have PFAS in our blood. Essentially, we all have PFAS in our systems. It's everywhere. Many of you will also know that this year the EPA has proposed a rule that would designate PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, another one of our lovely acronyms, more commonly known as Superfund. So if any of you are all dealing with any Superfund issues in your own states, do you really want one more thing you need to figure out? My answer is no, but yours may be different. But what's important at this point is that, while concerns about PFAS have certainly become more prevalent recently, and they are absolutely valid, we need to be intentional about how we craft our strategies and our responses to reduce our community's exposure to PFAS, because we don't want to make a bad situation worse. We don't want to overreact or underreact. We need a balance. But the bottom line for municipalities is that designating PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA stands to impose a significant unfunded mandate on local government. Because we don't generate this stuff. We're not making this stuff. We're not creating this. We are passive receivers. We just have to manage it, right? That's our charge, managing the waste that is generated in our communities. But the proposed rule with the EPA says that we will be responsible for remediation, because under the proposed rule with that language, it leaves any entity that even handles PFAS potentially will be liable for remediation. So the EPA's estimate for the cost to local governments, don't chuckle, is about $750 million. Estimates from folks like us who actually work in the industry, $4 billion. That is the impact to local government. EPA has potentially delayed the rule work until February of 2024, but this is temporary. It's a temporary respite, so we have a short amount of time to kind of get our act together. We need a long-term workable solution for this. So what we're going to do today is we're going to recount some of the history of how we got here, discuss what the EPA seems to be preparing to do, how local governments and other stakeholders can respond, how they have responded, and what the status is of and prospects for legislation that's been introduced in the Senate that could assist local governments in managing this by hopefully relieving us of the liability for remediation, among other issues. So our friend Judy Sheehan is here with us to talk about this. Judy is the Assistant Executive Director for the United States Conference of Mayors, and she will walk us through that. We're also going to hear from Pete Pistano and Maya Gilchrist with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and they're going to share with us how Minnesota is addressing PFAS, which we may want to look to as a model for others who want to replicate in part or in whole kind of what they're doing back home. And we're going to want to make sure to leave plenty of time after all the presentations for questions and comments, because I know we all have some concerns. Judy, you're up first. All right, thank you.
Sarah, I think next time I'm just going to give you the rest of my notes and you can present, because that was really, really good. So, and nothing like talking about PFAS at 2 o'clock in the afternoon after a lovely dinner, and there's soda and coffee over there to keep you guys all up to date. So PFAS, if you haven't heard before, yes, it's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You do not have to remember that. PFAS is an umbrella, PFAS. There's about 12,000 chemicals that fall underneath that umbrella. They're also known as forever chemicals because they are difficult to destroy and they don't dissipate or break down easily. They can be found in common products. They are found in your carpeting, in nonstick pans, food packaging, dental floss, firefighting foam, etc. The fact is that a lot of times you don't even know, mascara, you don't even know that you're taking in PFAS. And as Sarah mentioned, yes, according to the CDC, congratulations, 97% of Americans have detectable levels of PFAS in their bloodstream now, today. So, how dangerous is it? Science is still debating that a little bit. And because there's 12,000 different types of chemicals, if you really want to get bored out of your mind or just have glazed over, ask a scientist and a chemist the difference between long chain and short chain PFAS, and then just hold on for all you can, just because it's very, very difficult. And it's just very difficult to figure out because you get a lot of times conflicting scientists debating about what the long-term effects are. So today, I'm going to do an overview of the 3 major issues on PFAS that I think that is important for you all to understand, including the new proposed drinking water standards by EPA, the proposed CERCLA designation that Sarah just mentioned, and then the passive receiver protection that Sarah also mentioned. So for drinking water, I know a lot of you don't run drinking water systems, but this could impact you. EPA is proposing 4 part per trillion, and the final rule is expected in January of 2024. So just for perspective, the World Health Organization at one time said 70 parts per trillion in your drinking water supply was fine. EPA is going down to 4. So basically that means detection levels. It is going to be so sensitive that your person who's collecting your water will almost have to have their hands washed and gloves put on, because if they ate from a food package that had PFAS in it, it could detect in the water supply that they're submitting. So there's 3 ways of removing PFAS from your drinking water supplies that we know of now. One is granulated activated carbon. The other one is additional filters and reverse osmosis. Some of these cleaning technologies will need to be disposed of in some ways, which might expose you all to future liability. Same thing for wastewater. If you dispose of wastewater sludge on farms, for example, you also will be opening yourself for liability, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So CERCLA designation, also known as Superfund. EPA has proposed 6 different types of PFAS with a final rule to be declared a hazardous waste. And the final rule we're expecting February 2024. So 2024 looks like it'll be a banner year for fun. While this was moving forward, EPA said, hey, those 6 were great, let's add another 7. And so, but that's in the pre-rule stage. And so just for when you guys all talk to me during our monthly phone calls and you see me slightly exasperated, because every single time EPA issues something and it's going to cost us over $100 million, they have to consult with us first. We write a letter to say, do this, don't do that. Then they issue a rule. We have to write a letter for that. And then once they do something after that, we have to write another letter or lobby Congress. So it's been a lot of fun lately. So one of our worries with EPA proposing these 13 chemicals is you all getting caught in the liability web. Our worry, particularly with landfills, MRFs, airports, firefighting facilities, and disposal sites for sewage sludge, all will expose you. The question remains, for example, in the drinking water, for once you use a granulated activated carbon on the filters, will you have to find a hazardous waste site to dispose of this stuff? Or if you put it in a landfill and it leaches out, how are you held responsible? So EPA issued a recent memo in August because we've expressed our concern about being caught in a liability, And they said they do not intend to go after local governments. Are y'all feeling relieved now? They're not intending on going after you at all. I personally, I've had 30 years of experience. I don't feel completely comfortable with EPA saying, we're not going to go after you. You're not our intended audience. We're trying to get the polluter. But what happens all the time is you getting caught up in third-party lawsuits. So the person who is held mostly responsible will start searching out for other people to be held responsible. Who else contributed to it? If you know the joys of the 80s with landfills, even though like Industry X, you know they put 90 to 100% of the materials in there, they would still sue local governments because it was a landfill that everyone contributed. And so local governments are caught in this liability web, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, to defend themselves with lawyers, et cetera. So we are working really, which brings me to the next topic of PFAS and how to protect passive receivers. So just to let you know, there are 18 current legislation dealing with PFAS in the House and Senate right now. A lot of them dealing with procurement, alternatives to firefighting foam, the health impact and how to treat patients. But I wanted to particularly focus on the passive receivers portion. We are right now working with the Senate and House members and staff to find a solution. Many people understand why EPA labeled PFAS as a hazardous substance or are in the process of it, because they want to go to the upstream polluter and force them to stop doing what they're doing and producing it. But many people agree that CERCLA or Superfund might not be the right vehicle, and EPA might have, I don't know, use a different legislation law, such as TSCA or something else to go after it. But EPA is doing what they're doing, so unless we have a miracle and they don't do this in February, which I'm not counting on, this is going to be something we're dealing with. The one reason why CERCLA does not work very well for PFAS is because it was typically used for a site that was contaminated, and you try to figure out who was responsible, and you go upriver to the polluter. With PFAS, because it dissipates it goes so easily through our water systems, because it's so prevalent in everyday products, it's going to be, we know who produced some of this stuff, but to go upstream to that chain to figure out, to hold them 100% responsible is going to be very difficult. And while there are lawsuits, it was said this morning, those lawsuits and those settlements will go a long way, but they will not cover your costs. So a lot of people do agree that passive receivers should be protected, and it's an interesting little group that don't want that change to be made, and that's environmental groups, the chemical companies, and the trial lawyers. So that's an interesting little combination of people that are joining together against our position. So as I mentioned, we've been working with the Senate, particularly with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I would say as of January of last year, the Democrats were not sympathetic to our position. I mean, they're sympathetic, but they said there's nothing we can do about it. Through education, and we've been working in a coalition with about, I would say, 30 or 40 other organizations, groups like American Water Works Association, and anyone who represents that sort of, hey, we're just collecting this, it's a course of our municipal, what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. We did not create PFAS. With the exception of firefighting foam, we did not spread PFAS, and so we should be held at a different standard and not be held liable for the remediation costs. The Democrats have heard us. The Republicans have always been on board with us. What they cannot figure out is how to figure out the legislative fix without ticking off the environmental groups or without opening up CERCLA and creating unintended consequences. So we've been trying very hard to educate both Democratic and Republican members of the Senate ABW committee, for the House committee, and we've been doing letters, et cetera, and we've made headway, and I shouldn't be telling you this, but what they finally have decided to do is try to bring those of us who are passive receivers in with the environmental groups to discuss how is it we could find a fix. and air out our problems, air out our issues, and figure out if there's something that we could do that would be acceptable to both sides. I'm expecting that to be happening in the next few weeks. If you all have suggestions for legislative language or suggestions for me, I will be in that room, and I would strongly encourage you to come up to me. Maybe not during the drinking, maybe tomorrow, but but that would be any of your expertise. We do have some lawyers that are helping us with some of this language, and then ideally, we will hopefully find a solution that we can agree to and move it forward in both the Senate and the House. So I would encourage you to stay tuned, and I also would encourage you to educate your members of the House and Senate that this may be an issue for you and that we need to have a joint effort to try to fix this problem so you're not held liable for the tremendous costs. So thank you all very much.
I think I have to come down the steps here. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Pistano. I'm the manager of the water assessment section at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And I'm joined here today with my colleague, Maya Gilchrist, who's one of our research analysts. I kind of have multiple hats at the agency, one of which is overseeing the coordination of PFAS. I'm not necessarily directly working on PFAS, on all aspects of PFAS at the agency. We do have some within my section, but we partner directly with other environmental regulatory programs at our agency, as well as other agencies in the Minnesota. So, well, first of all, thank you for having us here and giving us the opportunity to talk about. Hello? Okay. Maybe I can just speak out loud. You all hear me? We're recording, so. Oh, okay. You're recording, so I got to go through here. All right. So talk a little bit about PFAS and what we're doing in the state of Minnesota. And let me double check. There we go. I'm not going to go through all this because Judy already talked about it, but you know these as forever chemicals. You see them in the news. They are ubiquitous, and one of the reasons why they are ubiquitous is because of how useful they are as chemicals. They're extremely fire resistant, oil and water soluble. They are really good at conducting electricity, fire resistant. I think I may have said that already. And so because of that, they are everywhere. So food packaging, firefighting foam, medical products, some of the clothes that we wear, firefighter turnout gear as well, lithium ion batteries, and a lot of these products do end up in the waste stream. And what I have here is just a graphic of the complexity of how PFAS ends up in the environment. So we usually point to industrial sources that's on your top left, and they can end up in our surface waters, in wastewater facilities that end up in biosolids, and eventually in landfills. They also end up in our homes and a lot of the products that we purchase, and any products that we end up throwing in the trash end up in landfills as well. So because of this nature, we know that it requires a coordinated and holistic approach to address this issue. Judy brought this up a little bit. Our agency is not necessarily the health experts, but we do have some expertise in this, and we usually rely on the health department on these aspects. But at a high level, PFAS have been shown to have associations with some immune responses, some developmental effects, some reproductive effects. Our Minnesota Department of Health has a number of health-based values on a few PFAS already, and some of those are tied into some of the drinking water regulation coming out of the federal government. And because, again, of how PFAS enters the environment, there are a number of different exposure routes that you end up. So they can go through drinking water, they can go through food consumption, fish consumption, Minnesota is a water state. We have a lot of fishing here, and PFAS do end up in our fish. And just very, very briefly, I'll talk a little bit about the history of PFAS here in the state. State agencies have been working on PFAS for about 2 decades now. If you aren't aware, 3M is based out of the Twin Cities metro area. And it started where we started investigating disposal sites where 3M was disposing some of their waste. And we found that PFAS was found also the drinking water in the communities nearby. And so this started a whole host of events over the last 2 decades that ended up culminating in the 3M settlement that was settled back in 2018. And over the last several years, we have been working with several of the East Metro communities on addressing PFAS, starting with investigating all of the sites around these disposal sites, as well as understanding potential toxicity of PFAS, and also investing in treatment for those East Metro communities. As we went through this journey, there have been a lot of scientific studies that have shown the prevalence of PFAS, some of its health effects, and we've also seen that, as you saw in the previous slide, it also shows up everywhere through air deposition, in the wastewater, in fish and wildlife, as well as solid waste. Very relevant for this audience. And so with that, over the last 5 years, the Pollution Control Agency has been partnering with many of our partner agencies on a holistic and coordinated effort in addressing PFAS. And so in February of 2021, we published our PFAS blueprint. And this is our coordinated effort and really in how to address this because of all of the ways that PFAS ends up in our environment. And if you're interested, I encourage you to go to this website. I don't know if Juby's planning on sharing the slide deck, but I got the thumbs up. And so we do have a link there on the PFAS blueprint that shows all of the different ways that we are addressing PFAS. And so I'll talk a little bit about what is in our blueprint. It is a pretty lengthy document, so if you want to read a Cliff Notes version, we also have a summary document that is not as long on our website as well. But in a nutshell, the blueprint covers 10 topic areas, some of which are not just within the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So for example, and I don't know if I have a pointer. I do have a pointer. All right. So quantifying PFAS risk in human health, that's out of the health department. We have fish consumption of fish and game. That's a partnership between the Pollution Control Agency, the Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Health. And then we also have, this one is at the PCA, and this is remediation. I know Judy talked about Superfund. We have state versions of our Superfund programs, and we are coordinating with our Superfund programs in this process. But in all of these different areas, you can sum up our PFAS blueprint in 3 major response actions. We either prevent it, manage it, or clean it up. Those are the 3 ways we are addressing PFAS here in the state of Minnesota. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Maya to kind of give a few examples of some of the specific actions that we're doing related to these 3 umbrellas, and really hammer home the point that the best way to address PFAS is to prevent it in the first place. So.
All right, thanks so much, Paul. Sorry, how do I? Okay, great. So one of the major efforts that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is working on right now that comes directly out of the PFAS blueprint is our PFAS monitoring plan. So the blueprint proposed a number of short-term initiatives to try and better understand the points at which PFAS is entering into our environment across the state. So the blueprint called for air emissions reporting from industrial and manufacturing facilities, for monitoring from monitoring municipal wastewater and the groundwater near solid waste facilities, as well as industrial wastewater and stormwater. So the PFAS monitoring plan seeks to coordinate all of these short-term initiatives under one umbrella. So in 2022, last spring, we announced a plan for monitoring at all of these facilities. So hundreds of facilities around Minnesota are either monitoring or have already monitored for PFAS in their environmental media. So again, this includes landfill and solid waste facilities. It includes manufacturing facilities. It includes airports that require the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foam, and it includes municipal wastewater treatment plants. So there's really three main goals of conducting this monitoring across our state. The first one is really important to gather Minnesota-specific data that can better inform our future PFAS policy efforts, especially as we attempt to start incorporating these higher-level PFAS policies into our everyday regulatory activities. It's important to make these decisions based on data that we're seeing on the ground here. The second is to be able to identify areas of concern that require quick follow-up. If we identify a location where PFAS emissions are posing an immediate risk to human or to ecological health, we want to know about those locations and to be able to mitigate the risk as quickly as possible. And the third, one of our goals for PFAS monitoring is to gather data that supports really our #1 goal of preventing pollution at the source. Paul earlier mentioned that the blueprint calls for the prevention, management, and cleanup of PFAS. We recognize in Minnesota that PFAS cleanup and treatment is time-consuming, it's very costly, and that pollution prevention is really the best and most sustainable strategy for addressing PFAS in the long term. So to start with one of the third strategy for addressing PFAS that comes out of our blueprint is PFAS remediation. So we do this in the cases where pollution prevention has not occurred or where management of the chemical release has not already happened. The PFAS remediation guidance was born out of the PFAS monitoring plan as part of the remediation's participation in that plan. And so the goal of this guidance is to provide kind of coordinated and consistent direction for investigation into and for the remediation of PFAS. It seeks to align state and federal designations of PFAS to be able to provide kind of consistent guidance and a consistent framework for our stakeholders. And this guidance development was really strongly shaped by participation with a stakeholder group. Over the past couple of years, this group, which consists of members from academia, from environmental labs, environmental consultants, municipalities, and partners in other state agencies, have been working on shaping this guidance. The guidance has been released for public comment, and that period actually just wrapped up. So our remediation division is anticipating releasing this guidance later this year, which we're very excited about. So on the PFAS management and prevention end, a couple of years ago, we received some money from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund to conduct a study into the costs of the treatment of PFAS in wastewater, in leachate from solid waste facilities, and from compost contact water. And, you know, just at a high level, the results of this study are that PFAS treatment is very, very expensive compared to the cost that it takes to manufacture or produce or purchase PFAS. On average, it costs about $50 to $1,000 per pound to buy PFAS for the production of the number of consumer products that we find PFAS in. But the cost to remove and destroy PFAS from wastewater is in the billions of dollars. So we see this 2.7 to 18 million, dollar range per pound of PFAS, again, to treat and completely destroy it. This range is based on economies of scale, so smaller facilities are going to see higher treatment costs per pound, whereas larger facilities will be closer to the low end of that range. So we really see the results of this study as quite staggering and really making a strong case for the prevention of PFAS release in the first place to avoid, seeing these kinds of costs of treatment down the line. And so to that, in the last state legislative session here in Minnesota, a number of initiatives passed aimed at addressing PFAS pollution, specifically in support of pollution prevention and in providing support to those dealing with the management of PFAS. One initiative that passed is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was directed to create water quality standards for those 6 PFAS that the EPA is currently proposing drinking water limits for. We're going to be increasing our capacity for PFAS monitoring in surface waters and fish. A ban on PFAS in firefighting foam is set to go into effect next year, and the Pollution Control Agency will be conducting research into ways to reduce PFAS in firefighting turnout gear and in supporting the health monitoring of firefighting workers. We are going to be developing a report, researching and providing a recommendation on assessing a fee from those upstream PFAS manufacturers. We have a number of grants. We have a pool of grant money that we will be providing to communities aimed at reducing incoming sources of PFAS. And we also have grants available for community water systems to deal with managing PFAS. One of the most significant items that came out of this legislation, out of the legislative session, was a pretty wide-ranging prohibition on PFAS in consumer products. So this law is known as Amara's Law. It will begin on January 1st, 2025. And starts off with the prohibition of PFAS for sale, distribution in Minnesota for 11 different consumer product categories. These include categories like fabric treatments, ski wax, carpeting, among other kind of everyday used consumer products. This comprehensive ban kind of builds upon a couple of more specific bans that were passed in earlier sessions. On July 1st, 2020, the ban on use of intentionally added PFAS in firefighting foam for training or testing purposes went into effect. And this January 2024, so a couple of months here, intentionally added PFAS in food packaging ban will go into effect, as well as a ban on intentionally added PFAS in firefighting foam, with a couple of exceptions. So this new law that passed, Amara's Law, is quite comprehensive, and it's one of the most comprehensive PFAS prohibition laws in the country. Maine is the one other state that has a law as comprehensive as this one, addressing all categories of PFAS. So one of the really kind of critical pieces of this law is that starting in 2026, facilities that are manufacturing products that contain intentionally added PFAS will be required to report on the PFAS in those products. This will really help us in our pollution prevention goals, having that information. And then starting in 2032, all other product categories, in addition to those 11 categories, PFAS will be prohibited for distribution or sale in Minnesota unless those products have been considered an essential use. And so that's all from me. Thanks so much for your time, and we welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody for your great presentations. We do want to hear from folks in the audience. So again, there's a microphone set up in the middle of the room. I think maybe someone can run around. Dave? Thank you. Thank you very much. The microphone wrangler for the back of the room. Appreciate that. And keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, that we are recording this session. So if you are attending in this conference via Zoom, there is a Q&A feature. So you can type in your question there, and Juby will be notified that you have a question available for the group. So any questions, come on up.
Good afternoon, Andrew Kays with the Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority in lovely Baltimore, Maryland. My question has to do with landfills and groundwater monitoring in particular. Has there been any guidance given to landfill operators about looking at their groundwater monitoring pumps or the equipment involved with their groundwater monitoring to see if they have legacy PFAS built into those systems?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I will admit that I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if Maya, if you do as well, but my understanding is I don't believe, at least in Minnesota, that we do. And obviously we're just speaking from a Minnesota perspective. So I don't know if it's happening at the federal level, but it certainly, I don't believe is happening at our agency or with the facilities that we work with.
I could be wrong, but I do not think that they have that yet. But I would think that that would be something that they'll be working on in the near future.
All right. Kind of in the same vein, on the newly instituted and upcoming reporting, at the manufacturing facilities, are those automatic transmission of data as they go through the discharge into their various streams, or are they self-reporting? And then how quickly, or how many audits are there each year on what's reported?
And my apologies, so you asked it specifically for Minnesota, or?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I know we're not there yet federally, but specifically to what you were talking about with your reporting requirements and monitoring.
Sure. So just to make sure I understand, you're describing the reporting requirements as part of our PFAS prohibition.
Yes.
Yeah, so those are going to be self-reported information from manufacturers that are using PFAS in their operations. We'll be collecting a variety of different data related to how the PFAS is used and which chemicals are being used, among other pieces of information. But those will be reported likely through some type of database.
And will there be any audits where you'll go out and check the data that's being provided based on your own independent review of their processes?
Yeah, so we should clarify too that the Amara's law just passed this session, and so we have to undergo some pretty extensive rulemaking in the state. And so part of that process is understanding what the law actually says and how do we actually implement that into our program. So we can't answer that questions right now as we work through some of those details, and it will go through, like I said, the rulemaking and has to go through and has to be written into rule, and then we have to work with an administrative law judge and all of the details kind of related to that. And we do expect that there is a lot of work that will need to go into understanding what is feasible and what fits in with our currently existing regulatory programs. And so we don't have an answer for that at this point.
All right, I have a question on the voluntary testing done at facilities. It's my understanding that the request from the agency was for landfills, compost sites, water treatment facilities, et cetera, to voluntarily test. One, what was the outcome of the voluntary testing, as in how many people actually voluntarily spent their own money to do it? And then two, the state received a bunch of money to actually pay to go and do those tests. How much was that? Was it enough? How do other states convince their folks to do the same?
So we are currently working on that report right now. So we expect to publish that monitoring plan report sometime this spring, which will have more of those details. So the data is still coming in. I guess we'll share right now that we didn't get all of the facilities that we asked to monitor to voluntarily do the sampling and analysis as well. And so the state did end up paying for some of those sampling as well, and we'll have more details of that once we publish the report sometime in the new calendar year.
Okay, one quick follow-up on that. And then in how the report is going to be released, is it going to disclose which samples came from which location? Or is it going to provide that layer of anonymity to the folks who did submit testing? Because I know there's a lot of concern around the people living by those places and finding a test result came back for something in their community and the liability of those individual places for submitting test samples.
Sure, and I think we're still deciding some of those, but I don't expect that we will be showing exact locations. In many ways, the report will be looking at it at a high level, and it will kind of just report back on some of our findings and not have it be, kind of tied directly to a facility or specific communities. Certainly, if there are any, hot hits, if you will, we will take action as an agency because that is our purview to oversee any type of enforcement as needed for anything that do have any type of standards, and we would have to take action in those cases. But from the purposes of the report, it will be at a high level.
I think part of that question that was just asked a couple seconds ago was about the settlement that you made with 3M, and whether or not any of those dollars have been used, and whether or not any of those dollars have been passed back to the municipal agencies that you've now required to do monitoring and reporting.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so just to clarify too, so it is the state attorney general, and the MPCA is kind of one of the co-trustees, so we have been tasked with facilitating the use of those funds. And we have partnered with many of the East Metro communities, so cities of Cottage Grove, Woodbury, Hastings, on a number of these efforts. We do publish an annual report on how those funds are being used, and if you search online for a 3M settlement, we do have a website that includes some of those details. So Maya and I are not part of our East Metro group, and it is a large effort that we're doing, but I'll just give a few examples of some of those activities. And like I said, just looking at the sources of the PFAS and seeing how it kind of goes through the entire kind of East Metro region, looking at some treatment technologies. One example that has been utilized is apparently some type of novel treatment technique called SAF that are one of the facilities, I forget which community it was able to employ. And so there's a lot of that already, but I think the bottom line is that we do believe that money is not enough to address PFAS as an issue, and that's why we're looking at it from a coordinated perspective and connecting with our partners at different, through different industries and understanding how we can do the source prevention. And as you can see from this last legislative session, we did have a number of different items that help to promote kind of that prevention approach to addressing this issue.
I have a question, actually. So in Vermont, there's essentially one landfill left in the state, and it's privatized. So with, I think, many of the landfills in the U.S. also privately owned, do you have any sense for, maybe anybody in the room who may be dealing with this too, or Judy, what is private industry doing to prepare for this? Because, again, I mean, we're looking at it certainly from what's the municipal, local government role, but with so many of our landfills and even commercial composting facilities being privately owned, there's going to have to be some either certainly costs associated with managing this material, and I'm assuming those costs have not been factored into the EPA's cost. Okay, so I got the answer there. But my question, I guess, would be for regulators in the room, yourselves, if you do license or permit these private facilities, will they be tying activities, PFAS destruction or monitoring? Is any of that going to be tied to permits? I know in Vermont, the latest expansion of the one landfill, they were required to, as a condition of their permit, to be conducting studies on the PFAS and the leachate and to come up with some mitigation plans.
I'm not going to. Okay. I'm not going to speak for Waste Management or any of the other landfill operators. If you guys would like to step up to the plate and answer, I think there is so much uncertainty as to, this is just a new brave world that we are entering. And so, like Andrew's question about leachate monitoring, I think that's coming down the line. I think anyone who's had any experience with owning and operating landfills, particularly in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where EPA did come after you and you were held responsible, and then you threw out the web of everyone else that contributed to it. That is unfortunately a guideline as to what might happen in the future. And so I'm not putting Waste Management cap or Republic or anyone else that runs a landfill, but I would be worried. And I would probably anticipate that there will be rules and regulations in the future, and how do I protect myself from liability, and what do I need to do in order to protect myself from that liability. But because PFAS is not easily destroyed, and I mean, how do you even do a leachate collection system? What do you do? Run it through a different system in order to do reverse osmosis and try to destroy it that way? I mean, those are all very, very costly additions. And what you were saying was that the next time a cell might be open, they might not want to even bother to do that. And this is the worry that we have explained to EPA of unintended consequences it should be addressed. But do you do it as a hammer approach, or do you try to figure out what all the consequences could be and how do we solve it together? So that's my 2 cents.
So I'll provide the. Hello? There we go. So provide a little bit of the Minnesota perspective, and I'll answer it in 2 kind of different ways. So the first one, and I believe this is unique to the state of Minnesota, is we have a closed landfill program, which the state does manage about maybe half of them across the state. And we did start doing some analysis of our leachate, for example. So we have worked with some of our environmental consultants to do a little bit of an analysis of our leachate and understanding the prevalence of PFAS in our closed landfills across the state. From the open landfills, if you will, so from a waste management perspective, we are exploring a number of different tools that are available to us to be able to address this. I should note that this is just one of the areas in how we are addressing PFAS, and so, I mean, at least to Judy's point, there is a likelihood that there will be some PFAS requirements and permits, at least in Minnesota. And again, this is a partnership that we want to have with the facilities that we work with communities as well, because this is not an easy issue to address. And we understand that. We understand that you are not the producers of PFAS, and we do want to work with the solid waste community and understanding the issue, and as well as addressing it and ensure that we are protecting human health and the environment.
So what can we do? As you know, what should we be doing? What should local municipalities be doing? How can we encourage our local elected officials to become educated or to really understand this very complex issue? How can we self-advocate here?
Yeah, I'll start. We have a blueprint here in Minnesota. I do recommend, all joking aside, it is a pretty comprehensive document, and it does look at a number of different issue areas. And I showed that slide that had 10 topic areas. If you look in the blueprint, it's a pretty comprehensive reporting on each of those 10 topic areas with some case studies, some of the work that's already been done, some of the work that's being proposed or being explored to be done across the country. And we do have some initial strategies that we are attempting to implement here in Minnesota. And so I do encourage you to take a look at that. This is a pretty complex issue, and it is still considered, we still call it at the agency a contaminant of emerging concern. And while it has entered the conversation, at least here in Minnesota, because 3M is here in our state, but it is a nationwide issue, and I will say also kind of globally as well. And so there are resources out there, and we do have that blueprint as a resource for other states and local governments as well. I don't know, Maya, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly, and our solid waste folks can really speak a lot more to this. Those that have been involved with working with facilities on PFAS monitoring, but I know that they're kind of exploring management tools right now, trying to look at the data to inform just how best management practices can be a tool for addressing PFAS going forward, and just kind of recognizing that those good management practices are really going to be key to kind of collaboratively tackling this issue.
Personally, I think there needs to be a little bit more research, and so once again, we have 12,000 different types of PFAS chemicals. Not all are made the same. One of the biggest problems we do have is you say the word PFAS, and oh my God, isn't that scary? It's like dioxin or arsenic or mercury, but how do you educate the consumer as to when we don't know exactly the impact? As I mentioned earlier, there's scientists that have disagreements. Even in the World Health Organization, they said 70 parts per trillion for water was acceptable. But the question is, if you had higher, they said, well, it's probably better to drink the water than to not drink the water. It's because it's not going to immediately, kill you or whatever, because there's not enough research on that. I'm like, okay, now what do we do with that? But one of the other things that I would strongly encourage is you to work with your, water and wastewater people and find out what kind of problem you have. The states of Minnesota, Michigan, Vermont, I think Connecticut are kind of leading the way, because they do have manufacturers that were upstream from them, and so they're the canaries in the coal mine. And so unfortunately they're first out of the gate, and so unfortunately we're going to learn from you all as to what we can expect in the future. The other key, though, is to determine and educate particularly your local elected officials about the costs and the unintended consequences, because that's something that we need to make sure that we educate Congress and Senate, and once again, not to just have a knee-jerk reaction, and to approach it in a protect public health. But once again, I have to do everything from PFAS to lead in drinking water pipes to any host of other problems what is all of our priorities when we don't have enough money to do them all? We have to rank some of these things, unless they're planning on federal government's giving us some money to deal with these problems, but not nearly enough. The Dows, the 3Ms, all those settlements, which, by the way, there's another settlement coming up in November. So if you'd like to sue there's plenty of law firms that are happy to add your names onto a lawsuit if that's a problem. So I guess please don't put your head in the sand. This might be an issue. This will probably be an issue. And the sooner you get out ahead of it, the better you'll be.
Thank you. Well, thank you again to Judy, Maya, and Paul. Let's have a round of applause, please, for our presenters. Thank you. And I have two announcements. First, we're going to take a short break, reconvene about 3:15. Second, more important, dessert is available. So help yourself. Thank you.